Hi, and welcome to Danny After Dark. If you're new here, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss a notification or a new episode. Tonight, I'll be featuring the case of Albert DeSalvo, also known as the Boston Strangler. Let's go ahead and find out more. Let's go ahead and dive on in. Albert Henry DeSalvo was born in Chelsea, Massachusetts on September 3rd, 1931. His parents, Frank and Charlotte, had 5 other children. His father was a violently abusive man who regularly beat his wife and children. As a young boy, Albert was always in trouble and arrested more than once on assault and battery charges. Throughout his adolescence, he went through waves, some of good behavior and then some lapses into petty crime. Albert's parents went on to later divorce, and his mother, Charlotte, remarried. Albert was in the Army from 1948 through 1956 and was stationed for a while in Germany. It was there where he met his wife, Irmgard Beck. At one time, he was even promoted to Specialist E5, but was later demoted to private for failing to obey an order. He received an honorable discharge. 1955, Albert was arrested for fondling a young girl, but those charges were later dropped. Later that same year, him and his wife had their first child, a daughter named Judy. Judy had a physical handicap in the form of congenital pelvic disease. This problem had a large impact on Albert's home life. His wife was terrified that if the couple had another child, this child would also have a handicap. So she did everything she could to avoid having sex. Albert, on the other hand, had an abnormally high sex drive, requiring sex many times a day. Between 1956 and 1960, he had several arrests for breaking and entering. Each time, he would only receive a suspended sentence. In 1960, Albert and his wife ended up having a second child, a son named Michael. Michael was born without any physical handicaps. In spite of his brushes with the law, Albert seemed to stay employed. Most people who knew him, they generally liked him. His boss characterized him as a good, decent family man and a good worker. He was a family man who treated his wife with love and tenderness. A couple of years before the strangling murders began, a series of strange sex offenses began in the Cambridge area. A man in his late 20s would knock at the door of an apartment, and if a young woman answered, he would introduce himself saying, quote, "My name is Johnson, and I work for a modeling agency. Your name was given to us by someone who thought you would make a good model," end quote. He would assure them that the modeling would not be in the nude or anything like that. It would just be evening gowns and swimsuits. The pay was $40 an hour, and he had been sent to get her measurements and other information if she was interested. Apparently, a number of women were interested and flattered, so they allowed him into their apartments to take their measurements. When he was finished, he told them that Mrs. Lewis from the modeling agency would be contacting them if the measurements were suitable to what they were looking for. Of course, there was never any call from Mrs. Lewis because neither she nor the modeling agency actually existed. Eventually, some of the women contacted the police. March 17th, 1961, Cambridge police caught a man trying to break into a house. Not only did he confess to the breaking and entering, but he confessed to being the measuring man. His name was Albert DeSalvo, a 29-year-old man with numerous arrests for breaking into apartments and stealing whatever money he would find. He lived in Malden with his wife and 2 small children. When asked by police why he did this, he stated, quote, "I'm not good looking, I'm not educated, but I was able to put something over on high-class people. They were all college kids, and I never had anything in life, and I outsmarted them," end quote. The judge was sympathetic to Albert's role as being the breadwinner of his family and reduced the sentence to 18 months. However, with good behavior, Albert was released in April 1962. Once released, Albert and his family moved to Boston. Between June 14th, 1962 and January 4th, 1964, 13 women in the Boston area were victims of being sexually assaulted and murdered by being strangled with articles of clothing. There was no signs of forced entry, so the women apparently either knew their assailants or voluntarily let him into their homes. The media came up with the term the Boston Strangler. The victims range in age from 19 years old to 85 years old. A couple of weeks after the murder of the last victim, the Massachusetts Attorney General, Edward Brooke, took over. The team that was assembled would coordinate the activities of the various police departments. There would be permanent staff who were assigned to the Strangler case that would not be pulled off it to work any other crimes that occurred. There would also be no withholding of police information between the various police departments. Back then, that was extremely common. 2 months later, the governor offered a $10,000 reward to anyone who had information leading to the arrest and conviction of the person who had committed the murders and the victims of the Boston Strangler. Now known as the Strangler Bureau, the task force had to collect, organize, and assimilate over 37,000 pages of material from the various police departments that had been involved in the case. The forensic medical experts saw important differences between the murders of the older women and the murders of the younger women. For that reason, they came to the conclusion it was unlikely that one person was responsible for all of these killings. In other words, they thought that some were copycat killings. A profile was put together and stated that the police should be looking for a male at least 30 years old, probably a good deal older. He is neat, orderly, and punctual. He either works with his hands or has a hobby involving handiwork. He is probably single, separated, or divorced. He would not impress the average observer as being crazy. He has no close friends of either sex. The task force, at a suggestion, involved Peter Herkos, who was a well-known Dutch psychic. 2 private groups paid for Peter's services and expenses. He was a very difficult person to work with and ultimately got himself into a situation for allegedly impersonating an FBI agent. However, before that happened, Peter identified a suspect, one who the Strangler Bureau had already investigated. This suspect was a shoe salesman with a history of mental illness. However, there was no evidence whatsoever to link the shoe salesman to any of the murders. Eventually, this man was committed to an institution on his own doing. The Strangler Bureau's credibility suffered big time on account of Peter's supposed psychic services. Meanwhile, November 1964, Albert DeSalvo was arrested again. A woman was attacked while she was in bed. He put a knife to her throat and said, quote, "Not a sound or I'll kill you," end quote. He kissed her and fondled her and then asked her how to get out of the apartment. Finally, he apologized and then fled. She was able to identify him to police, so he was arrested. But he was immediately released on bail. Routinely, his photo then went into the police teletype network, and soon calls came in from Connecticut, where they were seeking a sexual assailant that they called the Green Man. This was because he wore green work pants. Police arrested Albert at his home and arranged for the victims to identify him. He was mortified that his wife would see him in handcuffs. The odd thing is, his wife was not surprised. Albert was obsessed with sex. No one woman would ever be enough for him. Albert admitted to breaking into 400 apartments and to a couple of rapes. He had assaulted some 300 women in a 4-state area. However, given Albert's tendency to exaggerate, it's difficult to tell if the number is really that high. Albert was sent to Bridgewater State Hospital for observation. While the police did not believe that he could be the strangler, they wanted the psychiatrist there to examine him. 5 months later, he confessed to his lawyer, F. Lee Bailey, that he was the Boston Strangler. Immediately, the lawyer contacted Albert's wife, Irmgard. He told her, assume a different name and leave the area with your children. Go into hiding. This is to avoid the publicity that would descend upon you if you stay. The next day, she was told that her husband Albert had confessed to being the Boston Strangler. She couldn't understand why he would confess to a lie. There was no way that she could believe he was capable of such brutality. It had to be her husband's attempts to make himself seem important. When the lawyer questioned Albert, he was forthright, saying, quote, I know I'm going to have to spend the rest of my life locked up somewhere. I just hope it's a hospital and not a hole like this. But if I could tell my story to somebody who could write it, maybe I could make some money for my family, end quote. And most importantly, to say that he was the Boston Strangler would make him famous. The issue of intensive questioning of Albert on all of the murders and checking out every detail of his confession was critical to the case. The interrogation had more than 50 hours of tapes and 2,000 pages of transcripts. Eventually, the Strangler Bureau came to the conclusion that Albert DeSalvo was the Boston Strangler. January 20th, 1967. Albert DeSalvo was arrested and tried on the Green Man charges. The jury in his case found him guilty on all counts and sentenced him to life in prison. The psychiatric help that he wanted was denied. Albert DeSalvo was serving out his life sentence at Walpole State Prison when he was stabbed to death in November 1973. The night before he was murdered, he telephoned his doctor, Dr. Ames Roby, and asked to meet with him urgently. Albert was very frightened. Dr. Roby promised to meet with him the next morning, but Albert was murdered later that night. So, is this where the case ends? Not even close. Although Albert DeSalvo was never officially charged in the Boston Strangler murders due to lack of evidence, many believe he's not even the Boston Strangler. But why is that? There is not one shred of physical evidence that connected him to any of the murders, nor could any eyewitnesses identify him or place him even near the scenes of any of the crimes. Albert had a relatively memorable-looking face, particularly because he had a prominent beak-like nose. In fact, one person ended up saying, quote, now I know he is not the man, end quote. But what about Albert's confessions? How did he know so many details? Well, Albert had a remarkable memory, possibly even photogenic. And most importantly, Albert had access to newspapers. He would confess to some correct details, but also some information that was not accurate. This misinformation was in the same newspapers that Albert had access to. In fact, the nephew of the last victim did not believe that Albert killed his aunt. Casey Sherman uses Albert's confession to show this. Quote, Albert said he strangled Mary Sullivan with his hands. In reality, she was strangled with her own clothing. Albert claimed to have raped her, when evidence proved she was sexually assaulted with a broomstick. Albert claimed to have left a knife and a sweater at the murder scene, but neither were found there. Richard DeSalvo, Albert's brother, believes he confessed to the Boston Strangler killings because he knew he was going to go to prison for the rest of his life for other crimes. and he wanted to cash in on a book and movie deal and use the money to take care of his family. According to the family and Albert's lawyer, he was convinced that if he confessed, he would go to a mental institution rather than a prison. October 16th, 2000, 36 years after the death of victim Mary Sullivan, her body was exhumed to be examined for signs of her killer's real identity. A private autopsy was conducted following a request by her family and the family of Albert. However, arguing that the Boston Strangler case is still an open homicide investigation, the state and police have refused to share DNA evidence with the families of Albert DeSalvo and Mary Sullivan. The families believe that the Boston Police Department want to avoid the embarrassment of having to acknowledge that they have blamed the wrong man for the city's most infamous crime spree. To end this episode, here is a poem that Albert DeSalvo wrote a few years before his death. Quote, "Here is the story of the strangler, yet untold, the man who claims he murdered 13 women, young and old. The elusive strangler, there he goes. Where his wanderlust sends him, no one knows. He struck within the light of day, leaving not one clue astray. Young and old, their lips are sealed, their secret of death never revealed. Even though he is sick in mind, he's much too clever for the police to find. To reveal his secret will bring him fame, but burden his family with unwanted shame. Today he sits in a prison cell. Deep inside, only a secret he can tell. People everywhere are still in doubt. Is the strangler in prison or roaming about?" And that is the case of Albert DeSalvo. Thank you for sticking around for another episode of Danny After Dark. Do you have any questions or comments on the case? Do you believe Albert DeSalvo was the Boston Strangler? Or do you believe he was not? Leave it down below. Let's be interactive. Do you have a suggestion for a case that you'd like me to cover? Leave it down below. You may see it featured in an upcoming episode. Until next time, remember, we don't live in darkness. Darkness lives in us.